Hey, and welcome back to the show. So, today, ladies and gents, I'm going to be sharing with you everything about my ADHD diagnosis and how to go about managing money when you have ADHD. I recorded an episode specifically on this topic a few months ago. And at the time, I was going through a journey of my own personal assessment. And I kind of alluded to the fact that that might be going on, but didn't kind of share that in any detail. And it's been such a emotional journey. I'll be really honest with you. It's probably been one of the hardest things I've ever had to go through in a long time. And I've been processing a lot of the lessons, things that I've learned about myself, processing lots of research that I've been reading. I'm somebody who, now having been diagnosed with ADHD, understand why I'm like this. I get hyper focused. So I get super interested in something and then I research until I basically get bored and then I move on to something else. And so the whole journey around my ADHD diagnosis has been really interesting. And I thought sort of long and hard about whether I wanted to share this. And I thought, no, I'm going to share this because so many people in our community have reached out to me and shared their experience. And they've also asked me questions about, can this webinar be recorded and transcribed? Can you email me in advance of what you're going to be talking about? Like, we've had lots of people in our community asking specific requests because they know they have ADHD. And so I wanted to share this for you guys. And it's kind of therapeutic as well. Like, I think when you start to share something that's been a personal experience of your own, it actually helps you to process. So here goes. So I'm going to be talking about, first of all, what is ADHD? Then I'm going to talk about why I decided to go down this route of diagnosis. I'm going to be sharing some of my concerns about going through diagnosis, and then also how I did it. What was the process? What did I learn about myself? I'm going to be talking as well about how it affected my relationship with money. And then I'm going to talk about some tips specifically for ADHD money management that will complement the podcast that I shared a few months ago. And I'll pop a link to that in the show notes. And then I'll share with you what's next in my journey. So let's start off with just understanding, like, what is ADHD? Having been through this process, would honestly say that my interpretation or impression of ADHD is actually quite different from what it actually is. So ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. And I remember hearing this like many years ago, and my automatic go-to was ADHD is for people who can't sit still, don't have any attention, can't focus. And if I was to ask myself, do I relate to any of that? The answer would be no. Like, I am not a fidgeter generally. I can actually be quite focused, and I didn't really misbehave. Like, I had periods in my life of being a little bit naughty, and pushing boundaries and things like that, but nothing really significant. And so the actual definition of ADHD didn't really speak to me. But actually understanding really what ADHD is that it is a neurodevelopmental disorder, and it commonly happens in childhood, like it appears in childhood, but it's characterized in very different ways. So often ADHD is characterized, characterized, is that right? With this like pattern of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. And it really is the way that the brain functions, and it can alter and impact on our relationships. It can impact on schooling, on work, social communication, lots of areas of our lives. And ADHD are often grouped into two main categories. The first one is inattention, and the second is hyperactivity and impulsivity. Now, the inattention one is quite obvious, really. It's like difficulty with sustaining attention and staying focused on particular things. It can be struggling with following instructions or completing tasks. It can be to do with being easily distracted by stimulation. So sensory comes into ADHD a lot and quite significantly. And it can also be being distracted by our internal thoughts. Like your brain, it just feels like your brain just runs at 1,000,000 miles an hour and doesn't stop. And also for ADHD around inattention, it can show up in quite frequently making like careless mistakes, sometimes being clumsy, and difficulty with organization. Now, straight away, I'm already thinking about, people that I know have ADHD, and when it comes to money management, they're not filling in budget planners. They're potentially making careless mistakes or not realizing that they've got direct debits that are going out of their account because of the way that their brain operates. This isn't because they're being lazy. It's not because there's something wrong with them. It's not because they're bad with money. It's because of this inattention around ADHD, if assuming they have ADHD themselves. So that's like the inattention side. And then you've got hyperactivity and impulsivity. And this is typically characterized with excessive motor activity. So it's like fidgeting, squirming, sometimes like stimming, difficulty kind of remaining seated or engaging in sort of quieter activities. This was a big one for me growing up and still is now. I have to really be aware of my frequency to overtalk or interrupt other people. And it was really interesting because when I was going through my diagnosis, one of the consultants said to me, are you a good listener? And my immediate thought was, yes, I'm a coach. I'm very good at holding space. I'm very good at listening. And he said, yes, but were you as a kid? And I was like, no. I was like the donkey in Shrek. I was constantly putting my hand up in class. I was being told to be quiet, let somebody else talk, always interrupting other people. And I would literally be sitting on my seat, almost like bouncing, waiting for the other person to finish so that I could talk. And I wasn't very good at that. So I would always be interrupting. I remember my poor sister, she'd be like, just let me finish. So super interesting to think that I may consider myself and may actually be a good listener now, but I wasn't as a child. And often we go through these periods of masking and adapting and evolving and using strategies, or, I've been obviously practicing and sharpening the saw around my ability to listen as an adult, but very different as a child. And then the final one, which again has been a big one for me, is impulsiveness, and sometimes just thinking without any consequence at all. And I would say this is a huge one for me and still is. I'm very impulsive. I've spoken on numerous times on the podcast about how I believe it to be a real superpower. And actually the impulsive money story type that I created was based on me and my relationship to money. And it means that I can take risks. It means that I try things even if they fail, and I'll pick myself up and I just go again, or I'll try something different. There's never any fear for me around that. I take risks when it comes to investing, and I always go high risk in my investment portfolios. And I'm the sort of person who, I'm just so spontaneous. I could rock up to the airport with an empty suitcase and just fly to anywhere. That wouldn't bother me at all. The impulsiveness, especially with my relationship with money, has played out throughout all of my life. And having been through the diagnosis, I would definitely say that it's brought a lot more awareness to the link between ADHD and impulsivity, which I didn't know existed. I didn't know that that was a thing for ADHD. So that's like a summary, if you like, of ADHD. And the symptoms of ADHD will be very different for everybody. It's not like you're this or you're this. Like you have ADHD or you don't have ADHD. It's different for everybody. And there's different levels of severity. So my diagnosis was severe ADHD. Some people may have low or moderate ADHD, and there can be some links or crossovers on other neurodiverse spectrums, such as ASD, which is autism, which I was also assessed for, and also things like dyslexia, dyscalculus, which is all around numbers, and other areas too. So it can become quite a complex area. And the reason why I started this process was because I really wanted to better understand how I could support my children. Now, I know for sure that one of my boys is neurodiverse. I think my other one is too, but we are going through that process currently with my children. And I really wanted to better understand how I could be the best parent for them. And actually, I get really emotional just thinking about that because it matters so much to me. I really want to help to empower my boys, for them to be able to self-soothe, self-support, understand themselves, and not to be codependent on me, as a parent, but actually to really understand themselves and not to go into some of the patterns that I experienced as a child, where I was the perfectionist. Everything had to be perfect. I wanted to be well liked. And I know some of those things are nothing to do with ADHD, but I don't want my children to experience emotional states that I experienced and not be supported in the way that I would love to have been supported had I known I had ADHD. And one of the things that I'll talk about later actually is that it's really helped me to understand and have a lot of empathy for my parents and my siblings. Because understanding ADHD now, I can only imagine how difficult that would have been, having a child with ADHD and not recognizing that. And I know that my parents, my mum in particular, would never say like that I was a problematic child, but I really appreciate how she parented now knowing this information. So it's actually brought like a whole different layer into how I perceive things from my childhood, and also has uncovered some really interesting conversations between me and my mom and some family history, which I will share a little later. So that was the reason why it was so important for me to go through this journey. It was to better understand myself and to better understand my children. Now, some of the concerns that I had, I'll be really honest with you, was number one, I was worried what people would say. I was really worried about what would, especially family, like what would they say? Oh, like she's just making it up, or oh, I bet she hasn't got it, or like, oh, don't be ridiculous, or oh, like, yeah, she could never sit still, or whatever. Like they're complete stories in my head. And I do think there is a societal expectation around neurodiversity. I think we better understand it much more now than we used to, but I was really worried about what people would say. I was worried about what my team might say. And actually now having the diagnosis, I actually spoke to them last week after I had my diagnosis. This is still quite new for me. And I was sharing with them, just what was going on. And they've been so supportive, and it's been really interesting because even my executive assistant's been considering how she presents information to me and how she manages my diary to really support me and to support the business. So it's been a really great thing from a business perspective to share that with my team. What else was I worried about? I was worried about it being a trend. Everyone seems to be talking about ADHD. And I was thinking, am I just thinking about this because everyone's talking about it? Is this to do with, it's almost like that herd mentality. Everyone's talking about it, so I'll just jump on the bandwagon and talk about it as well and research it. And I didn't want to get to a place where I was researching it before my assessments, because I didn't want it to impact or influence my answers. So I actually did very little research around ADHD. I've done some research around ASD for other reasons with my family, but I didn't know much about ADHD at all. So I was worried about, is it a trend? Are people going to think, oh, Catherine's just somebody else that's been diagnosed with ADHD? So that was really concerning me. And the other thing that kept going through my head was, how do you know whether ADHD, whether do I have ADHD, or is it that because of some traumas that I experienced in my childhood and in my life, is that what's causing the symptoms of ADHD? Because there are lots of similarities. A number of conditions like anxiety, some personality disorders, and the effects of trauma can really present themselves in a very similar way to ADHD. So I was a bit kind of unsure about that. And actually, when I asked that question of my consultant, he said something really interesting. And I actually broke down in tears when he said this. And he said that children who are neurodiverse are more susceptible to experience trauma because of their neurodiversity. And I was like, whoa. And instantly I was thinking about times where I've been in situations, things that I won't actually share on the podcast, but there's been situations in my life where I've been in quite high risk scenarios and trauma has occurred. And that may quite possibly now on reflection be because of my ADHD. And so that's really helped me to better understand the conversations that I'll be having with my children, for example, around safety and security, and just being more aware of those kind of scenarios that they might get themselves into because they are quite, they may be impulsive, for example. I know my eldest son, for example, is very impulsive. So that was super interesting for me too. But that was the kind of things that I was really worried about. So where did I start with this? The first thing I did is I spoke to a whole bunch of friends, 3 friends in particular, who had gone through their own diagnosis recently in the last 3 or 4 years, all very different actually, some with ASD, some with ADHD, and I had some good conversations with them. I also had some conversations with the consultant in advance to sort of understand whether this was a good decision for me to make. And then the actual process was I decided to work, I am very fortunate, and I can see how fortunate I was in the fact that I was able to go privately. The waitlist in Jersey for adult assessment is over 2 years. And I know in the UK, I think the average wait time is around 9-10 months, sometimes longer. And I felt very fortunate that I was in a financial position to be able to pay to have it done privately. And I appreciate that. And so I decided to work with a consultant, and their process was that there was 2 individual assessors working together. They would assess me individually, and then they would build their own diagnosis report before coming together for their final assessment. And that for me felt really important because it was a very thorough analysis. I had to go into a office for several hours on several occasions to get a full psychiatric history assessment. My family were involved in some of those conversations and questionnaires that were completed. So it was a really thorough analysis. Some of you may have heard about some of the Panorama on BBC recently actually did a program about people going privately and having some negative reports around it. So I was, again, really curious and very aware of making sure that I was thoroughly assessed. And over those period of times, I was asked lots of questions. It was really emotional. I'll be really honest. It was really, really tough. And my nervous system was completely all over the place for about 2 or 3 weeks. I was doing lots of meditation and breath work and just really being kind to myself. What did I learn about myself through this process? I learned that how I am now is very different to how I was as a child. And I can see how much I mask. I can see how much my body is holding on to low levels of anxiety and is coming out through different illnesses. Like I've spoken on the podcast about issues I've had with my jaw, my teeth, my pelvis, all sorts of conditions over the years, which when I look back on it, have hugely contributed. I had eating disorders all through my teenage years and 20s. And I can see now that because my brain basically was lacking dopamine, which is a big part of what ADHD is, it's a lack of dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that plays a massively crucial role in the brain's reward and motivation system, is that I would look for ways to create that dopamine hit through impulsivity. So I learned a lot about that. I've actually gone on to learn quite a lot about some family history and some possible connections there. And just a real newfound respect for the role of my parents, especially my mum. And that's been a big part of just better understanding myself. As you can probably hear, I'm very emotional. My ability to feel emotion is very high. I'm very sensitive. I've always been called very sensitive. Oh, don't be so sensitive, Catherine. My friends would say that to me when I was little. And I now know that is just part of who I am. And I love that about myself. I love the fact that I can walk into a room and energetically read the room. I can work with someone and instantly see what the challenge is for them or what their next step should be based on that emotional connection. So I do really believe it can be a massive superpower. And so when I think about the context of money, how important is first of all, how important is dopamine in the context of money? Dopamine is so important in the context of money for this reward and pleasure system, because dopamine is often associated with feelings of pleasure and joy. And so when we experience something joyful, dopamine is released into a specific part of the brain. And a lot of ADHD, the areas that we are missing is in the prefrontal cortex part of the brain. This is where the emotional center is. This is where dopamine is stored. And the release of dopamine normally reinforces the behavior that leads to the reward, which then motivates us to seek, similar experiences in the future. And so they're hugely related to goal development, goal behavior, our ability to pursue goals, to sustain goals, all of those sorts of things. So dopamine is a huge part and very important in the context of talking about money and wealth and happiness. Also with risk, like dopamine massively influences how we assess risk and make decisions in uncertain situations. And there's been loads of studies that suggest that dopamine levels actually increase when we encounter unpredictability. How interesting is that? Also with impulsivity, like dopamine dysregulation can really contribute to impulsive behavior. So when those levels are out of balance, it can lead to difficulties in like delayed gratification, having to wait for things. And this can manifest itself in making quick decisions or in acting on immediate desires. It's very hard to wait or be patient or to understand the difference between a need and a want. Everything just becomes all important at the same time. It's hard for us to prioritize tasks, for example. So this had a massive impact on my relationship with money. I struggled with budgeting and planning, making big financial decisions, massive overspending and impulse spending tendencies. And my consultant actually said to me, I was like, yeah, but I'm not impulsive anymore with money. And he's like, yeah, you're not, because you're controlling it. But he said, it's still there. You're just suppressing it. And as he said that, I was like, yeah, he is right. Like, I'm very aware of it now, and I enforce all these different things to help me not to overspend, but it's still there. And so I think that's really important to understand that if you do have ADHD, one of the tips around minimizing impulsive spending is to have this like cooling off period where before you make big decisions, you delay them by leaving things in your shopping basket, for example, so that reduces your possibility of impulse spending. So let's move on to tips, actually. So aside from the tips I've already shared in my previous podcast, which I'll link in the show notes, the other thing that can be super helpful for anyone who's listening to this with ADHD or has children with ADHD is to create a financial system that makes things small and manageable, because often the big things we'll skirt around and put off for as long as possible. But the small, short, quick tasks are quite, they're easier to implement, should I say. So think about breaking those smaller goals into smaller, manageable steps, and consider using some budgeting apps. So I've talked a lot about how when I use Starling Bank, it massively changed my relationship with money. So have a think about whether considering budgeting apps or certain software to track your spending would also help you to create that really simple, structured financial system. I would also think about reward yourself. So this thinking about the dopamine hit here. Reward yourself when milestones are reached, because that will help you to create that dopamine, and it will reinforce those positive behaviors. Now, for a lot of people with ADHD, they'll have medication that actually helps to enhance the lack of dopamine in the brain. But I'm always a big believer in if you can do this naturally as well, or instead of, like, medication is definitely something that I'm going to be looking into. Like, I've been recommended to have medication, but I don't know how I feel about that at the moment, if I'm brutally honest. So that's what I'm going to be hyper focused on next, to have a look at, do I want to take medication? And I'll be looking at this with my consultant before I make any decisions. So think about those reward systems. Think about as well consolidating your accounts so that you can automate any like bill payments, expenses, just to reduce some of the cognitive load, because it's a part of the brain that just is not functioning as it should be. So consolidating your accounts, maybe just have like one main bank account rather than multiple accounts. If you've got multiple credit cards, for example, you could think about minimizing the number of credit cards that you've got to try and reduce the temptations. And also, it can be a bit chaotic sometimes if you've got multiple things that are going on. Like already I'm thinking I've got 3 different American Express credit cards that I only use for business for my 3 different businesses. And I'm already thinking, that's a lot. And every time my credit card statement comes through, I'm like, which one is that? Is it for this business or this business or this business? And the only reason I do it is to get the points. And I'm like, do you know what? I think actually just having it all through the bank account would just make more sense and make things easier for me. And I'll just forego the Amex rewards that I get on the back of it, just to really keep things really streamlined and really, really simple. So hopefully some of those tips are super useful for you. And just to finish off this episode, this has been a real personal one for me. So I hope that this has been interesting for you to consider if maybe you're thinking of going through this yourself, or you know someone who's had a recent diagnosis, or you're in my community and you have ADHD yourself. I hope that this is helpful and supportive for you to know that, like, I see you and I hear you, and there's definitely going to be things that we're going to be altering in our programs to bring back to this topic of ADHD. So the final thing is, like, what's next? So for me personally, I'm going to be exploring, do I want to take medication? Is that going to be supportive for me? I'm also going to be speaking to a brain doctor, because for me personally, if I can focus on my diet, my nutrition, things like breath work, which has lots of evidence to support how supportive it can be for ADHD, flooding that brain with endorphins and dopamine. That's what I'm going to be doing next. If I can be doing some of those things to better understand how I can make my ADHD symptoms that do impact on my life better, then I think that's always a good thing. And so it might be, for example, that if I can help my concentration, or if I can help the overwhelm that I often feel in my business, where I've got so many ideas, I'm like, what do I do with all these things? And also it will help me to think about how I can better support my communities with some of this research and things that I'm going to be going on to next. Of course I will, because it's the hyperfocus, right? But I really do believe that having ADHD doesn't change who I am. It's not a label for me. It's not, some people say, oh, it's an excuse. It's certainly not an excuse, but it has really helped me to better understand myself and how I can support myself, my team, my community, and my children. So thank you so much for listening to this episode. Please feel free to share this episode with anybody that you think this would be helpful for, any communities that you know of that talk about ADHD as well. I'm going to be connecting with some ADHD experts to actually bring onto the podcast later throughout the year, and also some other neurodiversity too, because I appreciate that ADHD is not the only thing. So thank you so much for listening, and I will see you again on the show next week. Take care, guys.